The sky over Europe was a canvas of grey, stretched thin by the cold winds of war. Below, fields and forests lay scarred, the remnants of battles fought long before the day, and above it, the roar of aircraft carved invisible paths through the clouds. In these skies, every pilot was more than a man in a machine. He was a lifeline, a messenger, a risk-taker whose courage often decided the fate of thousands. Among them, one pilot would soon face a mission so perilous, so desperate, that it would test the very limits of bravery and the thin line between life and death. His name was Lieutenant James Harrington, though few in the theatre of war would know it at the time. He was young, barely 24, with eyes that carried both the naivety of youth and the hardened shadow of experience that came from months of flying over enemy territory. His plane, a sleek, silver P-38 Lightning, gleamed even in the diffuse European light, its twin engines humming with the promise of speed and survival. But that promise was fragile. Every mission was a gamble, every landing a potential tragedy. And this day, this particular mission would demand everything from him, not just skill, but a courage that bordered on recklessness. The story begins not in the sky, but in a small, dimly lit briefing room tucked away in southern England. Maps were spread across the table like the topography of fate itself. Officers, clerks, and intelligence operatives leaned over them, tracing routes and making last-minute adjustments. Harrington, standing at the back of the room, barely dared to breathe. The mission was simple in words, but impossible in reality. A reconnaissance flight over the heart of occupied France, with the task of retrieving highly sensitive intelligence from a downed British operative. Every detail was critical. One mistake, one miscalculation, and not only would the intelligence be lost, but the lives of everyone involved could be forfeit. He had flown countless missions before, but nothing prepared him for the weight of this one. The operative they were trying to reach had risked everything to gather secrets of the German supply line, troop movements, radar positions, even plans for a major offensive that could tip the balance of the war. Without that intelligence, the Allies could not plan effectively. The operation wasn't just important, it was pivotal, and it was up to Harrington to ensure it reached safety. As the briefing ended, Harrington felt the familiar tension in his chest. The mixture of fear and adrenaline that came before every flight. He wasn't the type to dwell on it, though. Experience had taught him that hesitation could be fatal. He double-checked his gear, ran through emergency protocols in his mind, and finally climbed into the cockpit, the canopy closing with a finality that echoed louder than any gunfire. Around him, the airfield was a flurry of activity, ground crews wheeling equipment, mechanics shouting over the hum of engines, and other pilots preparing their own sorties, unaware of the mission that hung so heavily on his shoulders. The engines roared to life, shaking the fuselage, vibrating through his bones, a reminder of the power he now commanded and the responsibility that came with it. Harrington taxied to the runway, eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the clouds, in the heart of enemy territory, was the operative who had risked everything for the information that could save thousands of lives. Somewhere beyond that horizon was danger so immediate and absolute that most men would have turned back. But not Harrington. He had made a choice. Once in the air, there was no turning back. As he climbed, the English countryside fell away beneath him, fields and hedgerows shrinking into patterns of green and brown. The radio crackled intermittently, the voices of fellow pilots guiding him, checking in, reminding him that while he flew alone, he was not without support, yet the solitude of the cockpit was profound. Every decision, every adjustment of the throttle or the control stick, carried weight, and the closer he drew to France, the heavier that weight became. The skies over the channel were deceptively calm that day. Sunlight reflected off the water, glittering like shattered glass. But Harrington knew better. Calm skies were often a precursor to ambush. German fighters patrolled these routes, and anti-aircraft guns lurked beneath clouds and tree lines, invisible until it was too late. Every pilot learned to watch the skies for the first hint of danger, a shadow, a glint, the subtle whine of engines not belonging to his squadron. Harrington's training kicked in. Instincts honed by countless hours in the air guiding his eyes and hands. He thought briefly of home, of his mother, sitting in a small kitchen somewhere in Ohio, of his younger brother who idolized him, of friends lost on previous missions. Those thoughts were fleeting, because in moments like this, sentiment could be fatal. Focus was survival. Each cloud, each glimmer of sunlight, each curve of the coastline could hide an enemy or reveal a safe path. Every second in the sky was a balance between precision and chance, and Harrington understood that better than most. As he approached the French coast, the outline of forests and villages became clearer. The landscape was deceptively peaceful, a serene mask over the violence that had scarred the land. Harrington's instructions were specific: locate the operative, confirm the intelligence, and return without alerting enemy forces. The operative had been instructed to mark his location with a small, discreet flare, a signal only a trained pilot would recognize. Harrington scanned the terrain below, eyes narrowing, searching for that tiny spark of hope amidst the vast expanse. Then, finally, he saw it, a faint, deliberate flicker of light hidden among the trees. His heart leapt, not with relief, but with the intense awareness that the hardest part was just beginning. To reach the operative, he would have to descend into dangerous territory, flying low over the forest where ground fire could strike at any moment. He adjusted his controls, bringing the plane down with careful precision, every inch closer in negotiation with fate itself. The forest canopy rose to meet him, branches scraping the fuselage, forcing him to weave like a shadow through the trees. Below, the operative waited, crouched in a small clearing, papers clutched tightly, knowing that discovery could mean instant death. Harrington's eyes met the figure below, though only briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared understanding of the risks taken, the stakes at hand, and the courage required to see it through. In that fleeting moment, the world narrowed to a single point of focus: the landing. It had to be precise. Too fast, and the plane would crash; too slow, and he would become an easy target. Harrington adjusted his approach, muscles taut, senses stretched to their limits. Every second counted, every movement mattered. The roar of the engines, the whisper of wind, the distant echo of unseen artillery all became part of a rhythm he alone could follow. He touched down in the clearing with a skill born of desperation and experience, the plane skidding slightly on the uneven ground. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, like a drumbeat of inevitability, the dangers of the mission pressed in. Enemy patrols were near, likely alerted by the distant hum of the aircraft. Harrington had mere minutes to secure the intelligence and take off again before this delicate balance shattered into chaos. As he climbed from the cockpit, the operative handed over a small, waterproof satchel, the contents precious beyond measure. Harrington's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what he now carried. Secrets that could change the course of battles, lives that depended on his success, the fate of countless soldiers, all rested in his hands. And yet, there was no time for reflection. Every second here was a second closer to discovery. He returned to the cockpit, heart hammering, the weight of responsibility now joined by the ever-present fear of pursuit. The engines roared to life, and with a careful, tense motion, he lifted off, the forest falling away beneath him. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, though he knew that the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead, returning across enemy territory with the precious cargo intact. Above him, the sky seemed to stretch infinitely, a vast canvas of danger and possibility. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every glint of sunlight off metal could mark the presence of anti-aircraft guns. Harrington's mind raced, calculating angles, speeds, and altitudes, weighing the risks of detection against the imperative of survival. Each decision was a life-or-death gamble, a delicate dance with fate. As he climbed higher, leaving the forest and the operative behind, a thought flickered briefly through his mind: how fragile courage truly was. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and everything, the mission, the intelligence, his life could be lost. Yet, despite the fear, despite the danger, he pressed on. Because in war, courage was measured not in absence of fear, but in the willingness to act in spite of it. And so, with the satchel secured, the engines roaring, and the vast expanse of enemy territory stretching before him, Lieutenant James Harrington began the journey back, a journey that would demand every ounce of skill, every spark of intuition, and a bravery that few could comprehend. What awaited him in the skies ahead would test not only his abilities as a pilot, but his resolve as a man, and the outcome of this single flight would echo far beyond the cockpit, shaping events in ways that no one on the ground could yet imagine. The first stretch of the return flight was deceptively calm. Below him, the patchwork of French countryside unfolded like a miniature world, fields, rivers, and villages arranged in a pattern that seemed almost peaceful. But Harrington knew better. War never rested. Every forest edge could conceal anti-aircraft guns. Every winding road could carry enemy patrols. The intelligence he now carried was invaluable, and he was a target simply by virtue of possessing it. He adjusted the throttle, maintaining a low but cautious altitude to avoid detection from enemy radar. The satchel sat securely in the cockpit, a silent weight against his leg, a reminder of the stakes. Each moment stretched endlessly as he focused on the skies, scanning for the telltale glint of enemy aircraft. Hours of training flashed through his mind, the countless simulations, the briefings on enemy patterns, the warnings about fighter tactics. Yet, nothing in training could fully prepare a man for the reality of facing those tactics. In the open sky, knowing that a single mistake could end not only the mission but his life. The first sign of danger came suddenly. A flash of movement in the distance, the dark silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 cutting through the clouds. Harrington's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He knew the enemy would attempt to intercept any aircraft in this corridor, and his only chance was to stay unpredictable. He dove, rolled, and banked, using the P-38's speed and maneuverability to his advantage. The enemy fighter pursued, but Harrington had studied these skies, memorized the angles and currents, and for a tense few minutes, he outmaneuvered the attacker, disappearing into a cloud bank. The relief was brief. Once clear of the immediate threat, he knew more dangers waited farther ahead. Radar posts could track him, flak batteries could pepper the sky with death, and yet, every obstacle was a test of his skill, a test he could not afford to fail. The plane vibrated as he pushed it to its limits, the engines screaming in protest. Adjustment of the throttle, a delicate negotiation with metal and wind. The cockpit became a world unto itself, a universe of gauges, levers, and dials, where a single miscalculation could spell disaster. Harrington thought about the operative below, waiting for this intelligence to reach Allied command. That thought alone was a fuel more potent than any adrenaline surge, the knowledge that others depended on him, that thousands of lives could hinge on his actions. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but it also sharpened his focus. He became almost supernaturally aware of every movement, every shadow, every sound. Even the smallest detail, the angle of sunlight on the clouds, the shimmer of a distant river, could mean the difference between life and death. Hours passed like minutes as he navigated the dangerous territory. The low flight path gave him some protection from radar, but it left him exposed to visual detection from the ground. Each village, each farm, each road carried the possibility of sudden confrontation. Harrington adjusted his path, constantly weaving through hills and valleys, never allowing a straight line that could be predicted. His heart raced, but he had no time for fear. Fear would freeze him. Action would save him. And then came the moment that would haunt him forever. In a small clearing ahead, a squadron of German soldiers had gathered. They were likely performing routine reconnaissance or patrol, unaware that their observation point intersected with his path. Harrington realized immediately that flying over them at low altitude would guarantee discovery. But turning back would waste precious time, and climbing too high would expose him to radar-guided guns. He had to make a split-second decision, a decision that could cost him everything. With a controlled, precise dive, he banked the aircraft to the left, skimming the treetops in a maneuver so daring it bordered on recklessness. The ground rushed past at terrifying speed, wind screaming past the cockpit, the plane trembling under the strain. Below, the soldiers were momentarily confused, looking for the source of the shadow that raced across the ground. Harrington's heart pounded in his ears, but he did not flinch. Skill, instinct, and sheer will carried him past the danger, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself the faintest spark of triumph. The next phase of the journey tested him in a different way. The satchel containing the intelligence needed to be protected not just from discovery, but from accidents. Every jolt, every bump, every sudden maneuver carried the risk of damaging its contents. Harrington moved carefully, yet decisively, balancing the need for speed with the need for preservation. The plane was not just a machine, it was a vault, a fragile protector of secrets that could determine the outcome of battles. As he flew, Harrington reflected on the magnitude of what he carried. Maps, codes, enemy plans, all of it was irreplaceable. If it fell into the wrong hands, entire operations could fail, soldiers could be lost, and months of preparation could unravel in an instant. The stakes were unimaginable, yet he carried them as naturally as breathing, instinctively understanding that hesitation could be fatal. By late afternoon, the terrain began to shift. Hills rose to meet him, rivers carved their way through the countryside, and the shadows lengthened. Harrington knew that the approach to the coast would be the most perilous stretch of all. German defenses were concentrated here, anticipating Allied flights. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to cover every likely route, and fighter patrols could appear without warning. He had flown hundreds of miles already, but the hardest part remained. Then, as if the universe wanted to remind him of its cruelty, a sudden burst of flak exploded to his left. The shrapnel rained past the cockpit, some pieces grazing the fuselage. Harrington's hands tightened on the controls muscle, coiling like springs. Every motion had to be precise. One miscalculation, one overcorrection, and the plane could be torn apart in the sky. He ducked instinctively, the roar of explosions echoing in his ears, but never letting panic take hold. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. He banked, weaved, and climbed in a desperate ballet against the flak. The sky was a chaos of metal and smoke, and yet through it all, Harrington's focus never wavered. Every turn, every adjustment, every heartbeat was a calculation, a negotiation with death. The Satchel remained secure at his side, a silent reminder of the mission that would not fail not on his watch. As the flak batteries fell behind him, Harrington allowed himself a momentary glance at the horizon. The English coastline was faintly visible, a sliver of hope against the expanse of war-torn France. But even as relief flickered, he knew that danger was not over. German fighters could still appear, radar could still detect him, and the weather could turn in an instant, complicating his final approach. The journey demanded vigilance until the very last second. Flying over the channel, the waves below reflected the fading sun, turning the water into a glittering, restless mirror. Harrington's mind remained tense, calculating every mile, every maneuver, every threat. The flight had tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally. Hours of extreme concentration, split-second decisions, and high-stakes navigation had pushed him to his limits. Yet the reward, the knowledge that the intelligence would reach Allied command, was enough to keep him going. Enough to sustain the courage that now burned brighter than exhaustion or fear. Finally, the airfield in southern England came into view. Relief washed over Harrington, tempered by the awareness that the landing itself would demand the last reserves of his skill. A misjudged descent could ruin everything. The plane's engines screamed in protest as he adjusted altitude aligned with the runway and prepared for the final, critical maneuver. Every second mattered. Every foot, every yard of runway, every fraction of a decision could determine the outcome. As he touched down, the plane shuddered under the impact, tires skidding slightly on the tarmac, but Harrington kept it steady, guiding the aircraft to a halt with a precision born of exhaustion and unwavering determination. The mission was not yet complete, but the hardest part, the crossing of enemy territory, the evasion of fighters and flak, had been survived. He exhaled deeply, hands still trembling, as ground crews rushed forward. Understanding instinctively the significance of what had just occurred, Harrington climbed from the cockpit, the sun dipping behind clouds, casting long shadows across the airfield. In his hands, the Satchel remained intact, a tangible proof of courage and determination. He looked up at the sky, knowing that it had tested him beyond measure, and he had emerged victorious. Yet in that victory lay a quiet understanding of the cost, the fear, the risk, and the unspoken burden carried by every pilot who dared to challenge the skies during the darkest days of the war. The intelligence he delivered would go on to shape operations, saving countless lives and altering the course of battles. But for Harrington, the mission was personal, a testament to the human capacity for bravery in the face of near-impossible odds. He had risked everything, not for glory, not for recognition, but for a sense of duty, for the knowledge that courage could, in a single flight, change the tide of history. The airfield buzzed with the subdued excitement of a mission completed, though Harrington's mind was far from settled. The sun had nearly vanished behind the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like reminders of the peril he had just survived. In the quiet moments after the engines were cut, he allowed himself a brief reflection, but it was fleeting. The war did not pause for reflection, and neither could he. Inside the command tent, officers and intelligence operatives moved with a purposeful urgency, their eyes lighting up as Harrington handed over the satchel. The weight of what he carried, the maps, the coded documents, the meticulously gathered intelligence, was now transferred into the hands of those who could use it to save lives and strike at the enemy. As the flap of the tent closed behind him, Harrington felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion, mingled with a deep, unspoken pride. The documents were examined immediately. Fingers traced lines of enemy movements, routes that had been invisible until this moment, vulnerability in supply lines, plans for offensives that would now be anticipated and countered. What he had risked everything to carry was more than pay for it, was the lifeblood of strategy, a tool to save soldiers who had no idea just how close they had been to disaster. The significance of it settled in slowly, like a weight pressing gently but firmly on his shoulders. Yet, even in the aftermath of success, the cost of the mission could not be ignored. Harrington felt it in his muscles, in the persistent tremor of adrenaline, in the tight knot that never fully loosened in his chest. Every moment in the sky had demanded perfection, demanded courage, demanded that he push beyond human limits. The memory of enemy fighters streaking toward him, the sudden eruptions of flak, the terrifying dive into a forest, clearing all of it would remain, a permanent mark on his mind. He walked away from the plane slowly, running a hand across its sleek fuselage. The P-38 Lightning had been more than a machine. It had been a partner, a lifeline, an extension of his will. Without it, there would have been no successful mission. Without his own skill, his instincts, and his refusal to succumb to fear, the intelligence would have been lost, and the consequences would have been catastrophic. And yet, despite the physical and emotional toll, Harrington felt a strange clarity. Courage, he realized, was never about the absence of fear. It was about acting despite it, acting when hesitation could mean death. That night, the airfield fell into a calm punctuated only by the occasional murmur of men cleaning equipment, the distant hum of vehicles, and the whisper of wind across the runway. Harrington sat quietly, Satchel secured nearby, and allowed himself a single, long breath. He thought of the operative who had waited in the forest, risking everything for the mission, who had placed his trust in Harrington without hesitation. That trust, that shared courage, had forged a bond invisible yet unbreakable. It was a bond between men who understood the stakes of war, who understood what it meant to face death in the sky for something larger than themselves. In the following days, the consequences of his flight rippled outward. Operations were adjusted based on the intelligence he delivered. Supply routes were intercepted, offensives were planned with precision, and countless lives were spared. Harrington remained largely unknown to the public, his name absent from headline or official accounts, but his actions echoed through military strategy, in the war's quiet calculations, in the margins of maps, in the plans of commanders who never saw the danger firsthand. His courage was immortal. Even among fellow pilots, the story of his mission became legend not for bravado or recognition, but because it captured the essence of what it meant to serve in the skies during the darkest hours of the war. It was a tale told quietly over cups of coffee in airfields far from battle. A story of precision, instinct, and the relentless refusal to surrender to fear. Harrington had risked everything, and in doing so, he had defined what it truly meant to be a pilot in wartime, not just a wielder of weapons, but a guardian of life, a protector of hope, and a vessel for courage that could never be measured by medal alone. Looking back, the mission reveals a universal truth about war and heroism, that it is often the quiet, unseen acts that carry the most weight. The roar of cannons, the flash of machine guns, the visible chaos of battle, all of it is immediate and dramatic. But the small, precise, calculated acts of bravery, those are the ones that can alter the course of events in ways the world may never fully recognize. Harrington's flight was one such act. One man, one plane, one decision after another, navigating danger with skill, instinct, and a courage that could not be taught. As years passed, the story remained in the shadows, remembered mostly by those who understood the stakes, who knew what had been risked, and who understood the invisible threads of history that Harrington had helped weave. He never sought accolades, he never told the tale widely, and yet the impact of his flight endured. The intelligence he delivered influenced outcomes far beyond the clearing in France where the operative had waited. It saved lives, altered strategies, and became a quiet turning point in the relentless struggle of the skies over Europe. Even now, decades later, historians look back at such missions with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They study maps, examine reports, and trace the paths of planes through enemy territory. They uncover the moments of extreme danger, the decisions made in fractions of a second, the narrow margins between survival and catastrophe. And in these accounts, Harrington's courage shines not in headline or propaganda, but in the meticulous, life-altering consequence of a single man who dared to risk everything for the sake of duty, honor, and the lives of countless others. In the end, Lieutenant James Harrington's flight is more than a story of war. It is a story of human resilience, of courage under pressure, and of the extraordinary choices ordinary men make when confronted with impossible odds. It reminds us that heroism often hides in the quiet moments, in the split-second decisions, in the unglamorous, terrified. Reality of doing what must be done, despite every instinct to flee. It is the human story, at the core of history, the story of fear overcome by determination, of danger met with unwavering resolve, and of life preserved through courage that knew no compromise. Harrington returned to the skies many times after that mission, but none ever carried the same weight, the same stakes, or the same knowledge that a single flight had changed the course of events. He carried it with him always, the memory of the operative waiting in the clearing, the roar of engines over enemy territory, the flak that could have ended everything. And he carried it silently, a testament to the countless men whose courage shaped history without ever being recognized. And so, in the vast expanse of war sky, among the clouds and the endless horizon, one man's flight stands as a symbol that even in the darkest, most perilous moments, the choices we make, the risk we take, and the courage we summon can echo far beyond ourselves. Harrington risked everything that day, not for glory, not for medals, not for fame, but for the truth, for the mission, and for the lives that depended on him. And in doing so, he became a quiet, uncelebrated hero whose story reminds us all that the measure of courage is not in recognition, but in the willingness to act when it matters most. The war continued, as wars always do, but the ripples of that flight endured, invisible yet undeniable, testament to a single man's resolve in the face of impossible odds. And somewhere in the clouds above Europe, in the memory of those who flew, those who waited, and those who survived, Lieutenant James Harrington's courage still soars, a quiet reminder of the extraordinary power of ordinary men in extraordinary times. Years after the war ended, the world moved on, rebuilding from the rubble of cities and lives shattered by conflict. For most, the stories of individual bravery became footnotes in history books, buried beneath statistics and strategies. But in the quiet corners of military archives, in the memories of surviving comrades, and in the whispered accounts passed down through generations, certain flights, certain choices could never be forgotten. Harrington's flight was one of them. He returned to civilian life, walking among crowds unaware of the skies he had navigated and the risks he had survived. The P-38 Lightning, the roar of engines over enemy territory, the flak and fighter that had shadowed his every move, these belonged now to memory, vivid and inescapable. Harrington rarely spoke of the mission. He did not seek accolades, medals, or recognition. The satisfaction of knowing the intelligence reached its destination, of knowing lives were saved because of his courage, was enough. That alone was his reward. Historians would later study his flight in detail, piecing together the narrow escapes, the tactical decision, and the sheer audacity of descending into enemy territory to retrieve critical intelligence. They would marvel at the precision, the bravery, and the human element that machines and maps alone could never capture. And in those studies, the story of one young pilot would illuminate a universal truth, that the outcome of history often hinges not on armies or machinery, but on the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for something greater than themselves. Across the decades, veterans who had flown alongside Harrington remembered him not for heroics, but for the quiet determination that defined him. They remembered the focus in his eyes, the calm in his hands, and the unwavering commitment to duty that set him apart. In letters, diaries, and oral histories, his name was invoked with respect, symbol of the invisible threads that connect courage, sacrifice, and survival. Even today, when the story is told in documentaries, books, or lectures, audiences are drawn into that single flight, not merely for the drama, but for the human story at its core. Harrington's mission reminds us that courage is not always loud. It is not always recognized. Sometimes it is measured in silent decisions, in careful maneuvers, in a heartbeat of resolve that carries the weight of countless lives. It is measured in the willingness to face fear directly, to navigate chaos with clarity, and to act when the stakes are impossibly high. And so the legacy of that mission endures. It is a reminder that even in the midst of war, when the world is fractured and danger surrounds every moment, human courage can prevail. That a single pilot, armed with skill, instinct, and unwavering determination, can alter the course of events. That the choices of one man, in one plane, on one day, can echo far beyond himself, shaping history, preserving life, and inspiring generations yet to come. As we look back on that flight, over skies darkened by conflict and pierced by the roar of engines, we are reminded that heroism is rarely about glory. It is about resolve, responsibility, and the quiet knowledge that what we do matters, not just to ourselves, but to everyone whose fate intersects with ours. Harrington risked everything for intelligence that could save thousands, and in doing so, he taught us all a profound lesson, that courage is not defined by recognition, but by action when it matters most. In the end, the skies over Europe remain empty of those distant roars. The battle's long past, but the story of one man's flight remains. A story of bravery, precision, and unwavering duty. A story that reminds us that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit can soar, and one act of courage can change the course of history forever.